Good morning and welcome to this third lecture on research methodology. Today, basically, we are going to look at the argument. Every paper, every research paper that you write must have certain arguments to justify the statement that you are going to make at the end. So, every research problem is trying to address a certain research question, and you try to come up with some answers to that question. And these answers you don't arrive at these answers from nowhere. You begin to bring out some arguments. Either you bring out the arguments on your own, or you make use of the arguments others have used. So when you do actually the literature review, one of the things that you need to look for is to identify the arguments certain authors are making as part of their research, with which you are going to dialogue, we are going to converse, which you are also partly going to appropriate for your own research paper. You are going to build on that further. Therefore, it is very important for you to identify what an argument is. Ideally, an argument becomes very evident and clear in the course of logic. Even if you have not done that course, I cannot spend the time of explaining the different types of argument that exist. When you do logic, you can complement that. Now, basically, what I am trying to tell you is, in every argument, you will find certain premises and a conclusion. Now, what is a premise? A premise is a statement which, in relation to another statement, logically leads you to arrive at a conclusion. Now, the simple example of a premise, if you want to take the argument, which is very normally, very banal argument that is given, all human beings are mortal. Socrates is a human being, therefore Socrates is mortal. Now, this is an argument. Now, this argument is built on certain premises, certain statements. Now, what are the statements that are considered premises? The first statement that I said, all human beings are mortal. That statement helps you to draw a conclusion with regard to Socrates. But you cannot just draw the conclusion about Socrates' mortality from that statement alone. It has to be related to another premise. Therefore, the second premise is Socrates is a human person. When you put these two premises together, it is only logical to conclude that Socrates is mortal. So, two or more premises, when they are in relation to one another, you will logically derive the conclusion. So, premise is something that, in relation to another premise, helps us to arrive at a conclusion logically. You don't need to do any extra work, it is very evident. In other words, if all human beings are mortal, and if Socrates is a human being, Socrates is mortal. So, it is very evident. Now, this is typically an argument, a simplest form of argument. Now, the argument need not be always so simple like that. Arguments can be very complex. But to make you understand, I gave this example of this simple argument. Now, I am going to take up a few arguments that are used in philosophy. Now, in every argument, as I told you, there are premises and there is a conclusion. This conclusion is what we call the claim that you make. What is your claim? Your claim is Socrates is mortal. In order to justify your claim, that you are presenting an argument with the help of premises. So, when you say conclusion or claim, it means one and the same. So that is a claim that you are making. Now, in philosophy, there are certain arguments that are part of our philosophical thinking. Now, let us take, for example, the first argument, the example of an argument is about the human freedom. Now, there are people who deny that humans are free, there are others who affirm that we are free. People who deny that we are free are called the determinist. They say that we are determined, so we don't have freedom. Somebody else has determined our essence, what we are, and if we are determined human beings, then obviously we don't have freedom. So this is the typical argument about what is known as a hard determinism. Now, for the purpose of your understanding, I have put all these arguments in the form of a syllogism. Now, syllogism basically means series of statements which includes premises and the conclusion. So, as I told you, the conclusion is the claim of that argument. Now, other things are merely the premises that help you to arrive at the claim or the conclusion. Now, every time when you read somebody's research paper, you wouldn't find the argument in the syllogistic way. But for your understanding, I have now tried to put in a syllogistic form, a series of statements numbering 1, 2, 3. But that is not how you find it when you are actually reading an article. But then you must be able to pay attention to read that, and then perhaps you must be able to formulate in the syllogistic form so that you can understand the argument better and may be able to identify what is a claim. So the purpose of today's lecture is to help you to identify the claim. In other words, the conclusion the particular author arrives at by giving some interrelated premises, a logically deriving conclusion with the help of interrelated premises. Now, this is one argument. All human acts are determined. No determined actions are free. The word actions is missing from there. No human acts are free. Now, I want you to look at this argument and ask yourself, what is the claim of this argument? What are the premises that lead to the argument? I also should warn you, not all premises are necessarily based on certain solid evidence. Certain premises can be mere assumptions. Now, assumptions are things that are not established to be true or factual. There is no evidence to show that this is actually the case. So, premises can also be assumptions, and very often in many arguments, many premises are assumptions, and that may not make that argument a strong argument. In fact, that makes it very weak. Now, this is an example of that type. In any case, now let us try and identify what the claim is. If you have identified number 3 as the claim, then you are right, because that is the conclusion. Oftentimes conclusion come at the end, but not necessarily. Okay, in this case, the conclusion has come in the end. Even in the syllogistic form, people can place the conclusion in a different place. In this case, obviously, it is at the end, so it is a number 3. Why it is a claim? What I want to claim is, human actions are not free. That is the claim that I want to have. How do I argue that? I say, well, our actions are determined. Determined actions cannot be free. Therefore, our actions are not free, or no human actions are free. Now, this is a typical example of an argument, and the claim is at the end in the form of conclusion. If you have not fully gotten it, we will come back at the time of discussion. Those who hold that human beings are free, this is typically how they would present their argument. Some human acts are free. No determined acts are free. Some human acts are not determined. Now, think about it. Which is the claim? The claim here is some human acts are free. So the claim does not come at the end here. You begin with the claim and then you begin to give reasons why you are making the claim. Some human acts are free. Why do you want to say that? That is because determined actions are not free and some actions are not determined. Because some actions are not determined, some actions are free. So here the claim is given in the beginning. So now this is important for you to identify. It's not necessarily it is always at the end. So an author could start by asserting his or her claim, then try to justify it by giving reasons in the form of other premises. Now, as I told you, the authors don't always give, and most of the time they don't give the argument in the syllogistic form. It is up to you to make it into a syllogistic form so that you can follow the argument better. Okay, now here I have got a very long, lengthy argument. This is from Immanuel Kant. You will be studying about this later, but nevertheless, to make you understand the argument, I am giving an example from the theory of knowledge of Kant. Now, the argument goes like this. All that is or could be experienced is thinkable. What we experience actually and what we can experience, not only actually what we experience, but what we can experience can be thought of. We can think of it. Good. All that is thinkable is expressible in judgments. Whatever we can think, we must be able to make a judgment about it. We must be able to express it in form of some affirmations. That's what called judgment. All that is expressible in judgments is expressible with subjects and predicates. Now, when you want to express something, you should have it in a form of a sentence. A sentence would have subject and predicate. I will give you a simple example. The people's death rate in India is increasing due to COVID-19. The death rate of people in India is increasing due to COVID-19. Now, what am I talking about? I am expressing about something that I can think of in a form of an affirmation. That's the judgment I am making. How am I expressing? In a sentence. A sentence would have subjects and predicates. Now, what would be the subject here? Simple grammar. The death rate of people in India. That is the subject. What is the predicate? Is increasing due to coronavirus is the predicate. So all that is expressible in judgments is expressible with subjects and predicates. Now, all that is expressible with subject and predicates is about objects and properties. So I am speaking about a particular object here. Now, object does not necessarily mean for Kant only the empirical object. An object would also include what can be experienced as part of our reality. So, what is the object here is the death rate. And the properties obviously is about the manner that caused the death rate is COVID-19. So, the death is related to here its properties in terms of what has caused it. The reason why there is an increase in death rate. Now, all that is expressible with subject and predicates is about objects and properties. All that is or could be experienced is about objects and properties. Now, this is a very lengthy argument. I know it can be a little tricky, it can be a little confusing, especially in the beginning stage of your philosophy. Now, nevertheless, look at this argument. What is the claim in this argument? The claim is obviously the last sentence. The claim is very simple. If you want to experience something, you think you can experience, you think you experience actually something, it can be about objects and properties. So this is typical of Kant's epistemology. Of course, objects and properties are not merely that in empirical terms for him, but that is why, because that is the only thing that you can think of. Why you can think of that, he is explaining it further with other premises. Now let us go to Kant's ethics. All basic moral norms hold for all possible rational beings as such. No principles based on human natures hold for all possible rational beings as such. No basic moral norms are based on human nature. Here again, the last sentence is the claim. So, Kant is making a claim that our moral norms are not based on our nature. Why is that? He argues out saying, well, if moral norms are based on human natures, they cannot be applied for all possible rational beings. But moral norms must be applied for all possible rational beings. Therefore, we cannot reduce the moral norms to our nature. So this is a typical argument for Kantian ethics based on reason. Another example from Kant's ethics is, any adequate ethical theory provides necessary and universal principles. Nothing based on sense experience provides necessary and universal principles. No adequate ethical theory is based on sense experience. Here again, the third sentence is the claim. So Kant claims that ethical theory is not based on sense experience, or any ethical theory worthy of its name is not based on sense experience. Why? Because an ethical theory must have universal and necessary and universal principles, and sense experience does not provide you necessary and universal principles. So he uses these two related premises to arrive at the conclusion or the claim that no adequate ethical theory is based on sense experience. So you cannot develop an ethical theory based on sense experience. That's the idea. So your sense experience varies, so it may not be necessary and universal. And if something is not necessary and universal, that cannot become an ethical theory or a moral theory. So simple as that. Now let us look at another argument, now from the point of view of Hume, David Hume, again about ethics. All moral judgments influence our actions and feelings. Nothing from reason influences our actions and feelings. No moral judgments are from reason. Now again, the last sentence is the claim here. Our moral judgments do not come from our reason. Why our moral judgments do not come from our reason? Because moral judgments influence our actions and feelings, and what comes from our reason does not influence our actions and feelings. Therefore, moral judgments are not from reason. Now, I'm only presenting their arguments, not that we have to accept their argument. We can also refute. People have refuted these arguments, but it is for you to understand the claim, identify the claim in the argument, and distinguish it from the premises. Now, Aristotle, you'll probably have already studied Aristotle by now. So, he has a very important argument on emotions. All virtues are praised, no emotions are praised, no virtues are emotions. Again, it's the last sentence which is the claim: virtues are not emotions. Why? Virtues are praised, but emotions are not praised. So, virtues cannot be emotions. So, virtues are not emotions. No virtues are emotions. Aristotle's argument for God. God is a perfect being. All perfect beings are self-sufficient. No self-sufficient being is influenced by anything outside of itself. God is not influenced by anything outside of himself. Now, it may sound a little tricky, but if you pay careful attention, you know, here the claim is the first sentence. God is a perfect being. Why? He gives argument. If a perfect being is self-sufficient, a self-sufficient being is not influenced by anything outside of itself. God is not influenced anything outside of himself. Therefore, God is a perfect being. So here the claim is not at the end. He begins with the claim. I mean, at least in this argument, we have put the claim in the beginning, and then we have given the reasons for the claim. So a premise is basically reasons for the claim. But these premises, when they are related, the reasons become evident. That is what makes it an argument. Ayer on ethics. These things we will study later, but then only for the sake of identifying the argument, I am trying to identify the claim. I am trying to give some examples from these different philosophers. Only objective truths are part of philosophy. Nothing is an objective truth unless it is experimentally testable. Moral principles are not experimentally testable. Moral principles are not part of philosophy. Now here the last sentence is the claim. So the claim that Ayer makes is moral principles are not part of philosophy. Morality cannot be thought of as philosophy. That's a huge mistake for him. Why? Only objective truths can be part of philosophy. And what is an objective truth? Something you can experimentally test it, like in the laboratory. Like for example, when you say the earth revolves around the sun, now that can be experimentally testable. That makes it an objective truth. Now, no moral principles can be experimentally tested that way. You cannot test lying is wrong, just like you can test the earth revolves around the sun. So, moral principles are not part of philosophy, because objective truth means it must be tested. Now, that is built on an assumption. This can be critiqued anyways, but I am only trying to point out the argument goes like this, and he arrives at the claim, therefore moral principles are not part of philosophy. Whether it is a good argument or a bad argument, at this point we don't need to get into. We'll come back to that a little later. If you can identify the claim, that's fine. This is obviously a bad argument, because the assumption is very faulty. So we'll explain that when we come a little later. I don't want to give too much at one shot. Lewis on God and morality. There is objective moral law. If there is an objective moral law, then there is a source of the moral law. If there is a source of moral law, then there is God. There is God. Now here again, the claim is the last sentence. Lewis is arguing the existence of God by giving reasons from morality. There is God. Now, why do you say there is God? Well, because we have objective moral law. If there is an objective moral law, there should be a source for such objective moral law. And if there is a source, then there must be somebody who is above us who could give that, and therefore it is God. So simple as that. Now, this is a classical example. Again, it is discussed often in ethics. This is from one of the famous works of Plato, the Dialogues of Plato. I am sure you have already studied Plato. He has written many dialogues. By the time you graduate B.Ph. from here, at least one of the dialogues of Plato you must have read. Otherwise, doing philosophy for 2 years or 3 years is absolutely a waste of time if you have not even read one of the dialogues of Plato. Now, Euthyphro is the name of a dialogue, but also is the name of the main character in this particular dialogue. Now, I am not going to go into the context of it and so on. I am just going to present the argument here. Now, this is an argument that Socrates makes to Euthyphro. Again, when you read Plato's dialogues, you won't find it in this syllogistic way. Also, this is only a part of the argument. I have not given the whole argument. It's a very lengthy argument. Part of the argument, just to identify the claim. If ethics depends on God's will, then something is good because God desires it. So we say morality depends on God's will. What does that mean? Well, if God wants something, then that is good. So something is good because God wants it, God desires it. Now the second premise, something is not good because God desires it, because in fact it is the contrary. Something is already good, that is why God desires it. Therefore, ethics does not depend on God's will. Morality does not depend on God's will. Okay, now in fact the argument is not exactly the same. The argument is about piety. Now, but that has been appropriated by moral thinkers to apply to morality. Ontological argument of St. Anselm. Probably you are already into the medieval philosophy by now. You might have come across the famous St. Anselm. It is written Ansclm, but is pronounced as St. Anselm. Now, this is known as ontological argument because the argument is based on the being of God, okay? The nature of its being. If God exists in our understanding and not in reality, then we can conceive a being greater than God. We have an understanding about God. Even if you say that God doesn't exist, you do have an understanding about God to say He doesn't exist. And if He exists in our understanding, and if He does not exist really, then we must be able to think of a being who is greater than God. Second premise, we cannot think of a being greater than God. The fact is, none of us can think of a being greater than God, because the moment you think God, the highest possible being. And such understanding of God exists in our mind. Therefore, God exists really, in reality. Now, this is how Anselm makes his ontological argument. I mean, this is very powerfully influential. I mean, criticized by others and so on. A lot of critics are there. But later, this is further developed by other thinkers, including Descartes, has come up with his own ontological version of argument to show God's existence. St. Thomas Aquinas, probably you have studied this by now. He has these 5 ways to show God exists. One of the arguments I am presenting here, uncaused cause. So his argument is God is the first cause. So let us try and look at the argument. Some things are caused. For example, if I have a table, now this is caused by somebody else, maybe a carpenter. Also, it is also caused by the wood, the material cause. The carpenter is the efficient cause, and the tools that he used to make this table is the instrumental cause. By now you must have studied this, I am sure. fourth cause. The final cause is the table itself. Anything caused is caused by another. The table cannot cause itself. It must be caused by something else. So we know there are some things that are caused, and anything that is caused by another. Then there are only two possibilities. There must be a first cause from which things began to be caused, or there is an infinite series of past causes. It is called the infinite regress. You can go back, this caused that, that was caused by that, that was caused, you can go on and on infinitely. Now, there is no such infinite series of past causes. Therefore, there is a first cause. Now, obviously, the claim is the last statement. Where is the first cause? Of course, Aquinas calls this first cause as God. The reason why there is a first cause? Well, all other things are the reasons in terms of interrelated premises. Because we know there are some things that are caused, and what is caused by something else. And if things are caused and it is caused by something else, either there should be infinite regress, infinite series of past causes, or that must be a first cause. It must stop somewhere, which is the first cause. And there is no infinite series of past causes, and therefore there is a first cause, which is God for Aquinas. Now, with this, I have come to the end of this particular lecture. I know these arguments are not very easy all the time, particularly when you read a book, an article. It is not given in the syllogistic form. Even Aquinas, when you read Summa Theologiae, it is never in syllogism. Sometimes, yes, but mostly in terms of detailed explanation paragraphs. But it's up to you to correctly understand and formulate the syllogism. So, pay attention to this. Once you know what is the claim, then you may be able to identify easily what are the premises from which this claim is made. Are these premises based on facts or based on your assumptions? If it is based on your assumptions, can they be justified? Now this is the way you begin to critically look at the writing of the particular author which you are reading. So one of the important things that when you do research is to be able to read critically somebody's work, not just try to only understand, but to probe into it. So for that you need to know what is the argument the person is making for the particular purpose of positioning himself or herself vis-a-vis the research problem that the person is working on. And in the argument, what are the claims that the person is making, the author is making, and the claims are based on what? In other words, those premises are actually factual, or they are mere speculations, mere assumptions. Assumptions are something you take for granted. They are not necessarily shown to be true, but you simply assume them to be true. So if it is a mere assumption, then it makes a weak argument. Then there is a point for you to challenge that argument. So that is how many of these arguments are challenged, including Thomas Aquinas' uncaused cause argument. So with this, I end today's lecture. We shall spend a few minutes in discussion. Thank you very much.